we've been doing the center for 13 years now, and this event is so special for me. I just finished reading Catherine's book earlier, a couple of days ago, and I had a few moments today to write something and post it on my blog. So instead of having the traditional introduction to the speaker, I decided to read what I wrote about Catherine Liu, and maybe hopefully would not unsettle James too much. So at long last, we have an unapologetic socialist critique of the kind of sentimentality that passes for progressivism in American politics. In a short but tightly argued book, Virtue Hoarders, Catherine Liu takes on the professional managerial class, PMC, I guess that's the acronym for it, with their voracious need for virtue signaling on every fashionable social justice issue, especially race and gender these days, while methodically obfuscating, mostly out of their limited knowledge of history, I assume, as well as their unstated adherence to the status quo, which proffers its dubious goodies on them, the ravages of the economic system on their less fortunate fellow citizens. As a group, PMC, what the so-called populists have been calling global elites. Populism is, if I understand Liu correctly, a smokescreen for reactionary politics, and now the self-appointed saints of a world that increasingly casts the working classes to the dustbin of misery and cultural irrelevance, binding themselves to corporate interests and condemning themselves to a neurotic life of endless quests to reach and stay in their privileged social precincts. Thus, the idolized politicians we take for political heroes or saviors, folks like Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton, did nothing to advance the real interests of the African-American community, not to mention the working class, the infamous deplorables as a whole. We are now supposed to think that the New York Times 1619 project, supported by the private foundation, the Pulitzer Center, has the final word on race in American history, thereby, as Liu points out, dismissing the accepted scholarship that has been done on colonial America as simply the highly biased work of white males. To be sure, socialist historians were critical of this project, but then who in America knows what socialism is? Disdainful of the untamed passions of the working classes and dependent on the advice of experts and therapists to manage every aspect of their lives, whether it be child rearing, reading, and sexuality, a member of the PMC starts investing in her child before birth, signing up for prenatal yoga while setting up intrauterine Mozart streams on pregnant bellies. Once PMC babies reach college age, nothing is spared to get them into brand name institutions, including outright bribes and elaborate cheating strategies, as a recent Varsity Blues case revealed to a seemingly scandalized media. While these nouveaux bourgeois corrupt the body politic with the high-end shenanigans, they impose an implacable austerity on their own physical bodies, subjecting them to keto diets and intermittent fasting, not to mention never-ending marathons on treadmills. You would think that such snobs would be the perfect match for a culture of libertinage. I'm using my French pronunciation here. But no, that is too risky, emotionally and financially. Sex for PMC is best regulated through self-help books and government edicts, while promiscuous members of the lower orders indulge at their own social peril. Perplexing questions remain for Liu and all socialists. What keeps postponing the revolution now that economic barbarism has generated the technologies and surpluses needed for this kind of revolution? Are we honestly capable of liquidating PMC values in ourselves now that we know? These questions open up the possibility for new ideas and theories, a prospect I thought was long dead and buried. In any case, Liu's book jolted me out of long COVID doldrums and rushed me back and forced me to read, after years of procrastination, Terry Eagleton's Why Marx Was Right. Thank you so much, Liu. And with that, I welcome you to...
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you so much. Well, that was maybe the best introduction I've ever had. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who helped get me here, especially Neil and Lucille, and of course Anouar. I'm going to go in to the lecture without further ado. I hope that there will be ample time for Q&A, and I'm willing to stay longer because this is a longer paper than I'm used to giving. And I like a lot of interaction with the audience, but let me be patient with me and let me get through some of these arguments, because you'll see that they're both provocative and kind of, I don't know, nerdy. Nerdy is good. Okay. It's the holiday season and trauma is in the air. I feel it in my fingers. I feel it in my toes. Everywhere there's talk of trauma. We have indeed lived through very difficult times, but the New York Times and our HR departments are eager to talk about that experience in terms of trauma, which only minimally describes the collective experience of fear and uncertainty that we have all lived in the past 20 months. In my university, for instance, we are being told that we must now adopt, quote unquote, trauma-informed pedagogy. This is a fancy way of saying that we should all take it easier on our students in terms of deadlines and grading. So I want to pause with you today to explore the meaning of the term and the emergence of trauma studies, as well as the use of trauma in the public sphere in the past 30 to 40 years. I will not give a definition of trauma or go into the elaborate debates over this definition, which I could if you wanted me to, but they're incredibly tedious at this point for me. I'm going to be historiographical and theoretical, but you should know that my ideas about trauma are deeply informed by my own experience as an analysand in a long psychoanalysis. But on with the paper. I'm eager to discuss all of these issues afterwards. It wasn't so long ago that the classroom was defined as a tiny fragment of Jürgen Habermas's bourgeois public sphere, a place where reason and argument were to be exercised in the name of dissent and skepticism, in contrast with the stifling atmosphere in the royal courts and churches of clerics, tyrants, and monarchs. Here's a picture of the court of Louis XIV. This portrays my own PhD in French, and then various etchings of the coffee houses that were opening in London in the 18th century. For Habermas, the intellectual and political repressiveness of the court society presaged its demise in the tumult of mercantile activity and the accompanying contest of ideas that would bring about in true Enlightenment fashion, in this idealized way, the most emancipatory and enlightened conclusions on all manner of debate, philosophical, political, and scientific. So in the coffee house, Habermas said, this was a new kind of space. It was mercantile, it was neither public nor completely private. There were newspapers and postings about the East Indies company's shipments and things like that, and men who were property owning, who were speculating on British colonialism, would come and discuss the ideas of the day. And this kind of new public sphere was in direct contrast to the kind of repressive, feudal space of the court. And this is a really important transition here from court society to coffee house. And in the coffee house, it wasn't what your father was or how much money you had that would determine the weight of what you said. It was your ability to reason in public that would engage you in some kind of higher authority in argument. Of course, this is all ideal. I mean, Habermas is talking about an ideal, but it was a historic turn in what would adjudicate, like speech in these semi-public spaces. Those excluded from Habermas's public sphere are legion, but it is in the spirit of bourgeois enlightenment that inclusivity is one of the most important values touted by liberals and their managerial strategies. The public sphere, as it emerged from the Enlightenment, implied, of course, a private sphere of private experience, private life, private thoughts. So at the same time you have this emergence of the public sphere, you have the emergence of the ideal of privacy in the European world. Privacy was a European bourgeois innovation. Aristocrats, before the bourgeois turn, didn't care if their servants saw them copulate or defecate. Bodily modesty was claimed by the wealthy mercantile bourgeois women who pioneered silent reading of novels. And this allowed a newly literate and leisured class to explore their inner lives in letter writing and the reading of literature. So you have very restricted literacy up until the 18th century. Then you have this new form of reading and novel writing where you have silent reading. The move from like clerical recitation of the Psalms and the holy books to this private reading is a really important moment in the evolution of the human subject, of human bourgeois subjectivity. In fact, the first postal service in Europe, run by the Turn von Taxis family in what is now known as Germany, prided itself on its ability to protect the privacy of letters it delivered. Until the early 1970s, the liberal ideal of the public-private divide, combined with a Christian tight-lippedness about mental anguish, continued the exclusion of matters of mental health from public life. So matters of mental health were considered irrational and inadmissible to public discussion. In 1972, George McGovern asked Thomas Eagleton of Missouri to be his running mate in his presidential campaign against Richard Nixon. McGovern was nominated by the Democratic Convention in Miami. When it was revealed very shortly thereafter that Eagleton had received electroshock therapy for depression, McGovern's bid for president was severely, if not fatally, damaged. Eagleton's struggle with mental illness were immediately attacked by Republicans, and McGovern was accused of being a man who lacked political judgment. So great was the fear of mental illness and the disorder and unreason it could unleash, McGovern dropped Eagleton from the ticket when psychiatrists he consulted confirmed that Eagleton's struggle with mental health could be a threat to national security. Like the ruling elites of the time, Eagleton and McGovern operated in a world where effective political participation was based upon one's ability to exercise reason by containing one's emotions and keeping private mental suffering out of the public eye and out of public life. So it was this shameful secret of Eagleton's. In 1972, American politics operated under the restrictive ideals of Habermas's bourgeois sphere. It still operated like that. Depression was identified with a pre-modern force of melancholia that could possess a person and deprive her of sovereignty and agency. Habermas has been roundly criticized for his neglect of class, race, gender, and sexuality in his analysis of the European Enlightenment. But his argument that the Enlightenment gave us the tools to democratize the public sphere by making the exercise of reason a universal capacity and right includes the liberal expansion of the public sphere engineered by the post-1968 social movements. Two other conditions of American life have shaped contemporary liberalism's ideological powers and political imagination. And this is where the PMC comes in, the professional managerial class comes in. One is the demise of print media, the evolution of broadcast media into social media as controlled by a few powerful Silicon Valley corporations, and the transformation of the public sphere into an arena for data collection and monetization. The second is so you have this collaboration with the governmental forces and Silicon Valley corporations, and the second conditioning evolution of the public sphere is the coming into political consciousness of professionals who have been able to represent, define, commodify, and exploit public expressions of suffering and private experiences of healing and recovery. Human beings are no strangers to suffering. We have always been vulnerable to the shock of an unforeseen violation of one's body, mind, and spirit, and the suffering that ensues that violation. But the public discourse of trauma as a psychological and medical concept emerges in the 19th century in the United Kingdom and is treated in relationship to emerging forms of transportation technology. Railway spine was a legitimate diagnosis in 19th century England, invented to account for railroad company liability in the case of railway accidents. Trauma from its very beginning then was a litigious and legal category, even before it was a psychological category. They said there were people who suffered the after effects of a railway accident, men, mostly traveling for leisure or business, and they couldn't identify any specific injury to the body. Many of these men just suffered from the shock. So they said there was something like that that affected their spines, that rearranged the chemical composition of their spines, and therefore they suffered from this neurological damage, and that's why they called it the railway trauma railroad spine. Since the 1960s, the New Left has taught us that human suffering could only be understood and healed by the actions of professionals and activists, and more importantly, that private suffering could be turned into public action and activism. So this is genuinely new in the New Left. I'll explain how. The personal had become the political. In the ferment of anti-war protests and feminist political agitation, a class of liberals reframed suffering in two ways, divided along gender lines: war trauma, or PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and sexual violence. On the one hand, Judith Herman's The Courage to Heal has become a feminist textbook on sexual trauma and its recovery. Herman explores the nature of sexual trauma and sexual abuse and politicizes the violence against women, and as well as its healing processes, by framing and centering the issues of gender and domination. On the other hand, there was Robert J. Lifton, the anti-war clinician, whose advocacy for Vietnam veterans led to the introduction of post-traumatic stress syndrome in the 1980 DSM, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, that's used by psychologists and that your president knows probably more about than I do. It's a guide to mental disorders recognized by insurance companies, psychiatrists, and psychopharmacological companies as well. Lifton documented his experiences with group therapy in his book, Home from the War. The most striking thing about the arc of healing projected by Lifton's analysis of the rap groups run by Vietnam vets against the war was that the therapeutic collective discovery of one's guilt and suffering was the path to anti-war activism. The book I'm writing on trauma and the rise of the professional managerial class during the years 1972 to 2008 looks at how, in the years that followed the social and cultural unrest of the 60s, the liberal PMC successfully reaffirmed the American media public sphere as one in which the identity of the survivor becomes enshrined in public discourse. And survivor is a term that both Herman and Lifton used to dignify those of us who had survived enormous shocks and traumas. One thing I'll say as an aside is that he used the term, he treated men who had committed heinous war crimes in Vietnam, but as long as they could enter this discourse of survival, they could find redemption in becoming anti-war vets. I'm not going to comment further on that. I mean, I think it leaves us with a number of ethical, political, and moral questions, though. But that, Lifton didn't raise, and that the fervor of anti-war activism didn't want to question, because otherwise you sound like a pro-war Republican or a radical anti-war Maoist or something, either one of those two. Anyway, last year, Routledge published a 500-page anthology called A Companion to Literature and Trauma. Routledge claims to be the most important academic press in the world, publishing over 5,000 titles a year, as well as 1,800 academic journals. It is a for-profit company based in the United Kingdom that was acquired in 1998 by its competitor, Taylor & Francis. This is part of the sort of media consolidation that we see everywhere. In this anthology, the editors, Colin Davis and Hannah Meritoya, define trauma as, quote, psychological injury, lasting damage done to individuals and communities by tragic events or severe distress. Tragic events seem to be outside human control. Note the passive voice in the editorial formulation. It's injury done to individual communities by tragic events. There's no human agent in here. or severe distress. I have argued in Virtual Hoarders that the professional managerial class works in white-collar jobs that do not harm them physically. In a way, this trauma, because it's non-physical, it's psychological distress, is like their ideal thing, form of damage in some ways. The editors, in emphasizing psychological as opposed to physical injury, follow the leading thinkers of trauma studies like Kathy Carruth and Shoshana Fellman, who were avid readers and interpreters of Sigmund Freud, Paul de Man, and Jacques Derrida. From Freud, trauma studies gets a very specific idea about belatedness and shell shock. When treating soldiers returning from World War I, Freud found that the veterans who had not been wounded physically in their grueling war experiences suffered the most severe forms of the psychological disorder of shell shock. If you weren't wounded and you came back from the war, you were more plagued by recurrent nightmares, inability to confront the contemporary situation as it was. And from de Man, trauma studies gets the idea that in experiencing and communicating about trauma, aporia is the most important term. Aporia is a logical or linguistic breakdown or impasse that indicates difficulty or rupture. So from Freud, trauma studies gets belatedness. From de Man, they get this idea of how you reach a rupture when you're communicating about trauma that leaves you unable to really go on and put it into words. So it's important to honor this rupture, this break, right? I used to imitate the aporia of trauma studies like this. From Derrida, Carruth, and Fellman, learned the importance of close textual readings and a Heideggerian respect for the unapproachability or intractability of the other. Carruth and Fellman's contribution to the history of literary and trauma studies is undeniable. After their mentor, Paul de Man, died in 1983, Belgian researcher Ortwin de Graaf discovered that de Man wrote regularly in occupied Belgium for a Nazi newspaper. His wartime columns are replete with banal repetitions of anti-Semitic and pro-German propaganda, all in the name of cultural criticism. The exposure of de Man's Nazi sympathies and complicity was no doubt traumatizing for his former students, who had revered him as a master critic and pedagogue. They were ready, however, to promote a new approach to history and suffering that would exonerate literary theory and deconstruction from its critics' accusations of ethical and political turpitude. Ready to counter critics of deconstruction and literary studies as blatantly ahistorical, Carruth and Fellman focused on the Holocaust as an event that was the most important traumatic event in human history, and that the Holocaust for them had created a rupture in the fabric of the human itself. Why is it important for me to retrace this history? Because trauma studies actually attacks history and historical understanding, and has participated in promoting an ideology of individual suffering that is remarkably well adapted to the politicized amnesia of late capitalism. Witness the following passages in Carruth's Unclaimed Experience, a trauma studies text written when the Paul de Man scandal was still fresh in everyone's minds. I wanted to highlight stuff, but I didn't really know how to do it, so I'm just going to read this. Through the notion of trauma, I will argue that we can understand that a rethinking of reference is not aimed at eliminating history, but at resituating it in our understanding. That is, in precisely permitting history to arise where immediate understanding may not. I wonder, that's like total obfuscation. Immediate understanding is the enemy for Carruth here, but why the defensive hedge against eliminating history in the first place? I would argue because what Carruth would actually like to eliminate is the history revealed of Paul de Man's complicity with his Nazi occupation in his native Belgium. And what she hopes to argue for is that normal, average, non-trauma theory-infused people simply do not understand what happened in the past because we are so dumb that we expect, when confronted with history, something that only the uneducated would believe in, immediate understanding. She's like, history arises where immediate understanding, may not. And I'm just like, okay, that doesn't mean it. This is obfuscation. I've shown in Virtue Hoarders that the professional managerial class elites are really adept at making things the uninitiated thought we understood incomprehensible. And I wouldn't call myself uninitiated, like I was their student. But now when I read this in an honest way, I find it totally incomprehensible, or just like logically it falls apart. I was a student of Carruth and Feldman's. Deconstruction was important to me and to my intellectual formation. And it is a carapace and a shell, a defensive shell, that I've spent years trying to escape. Certainly, all the figures cited above were powerful teachers and writers, and their influence on American intellectual life and politics seems only to be growing, but not in the ways they expected. Carruth and Feldman may have been sequestered in the ivory tower, working on Freud, de Man, and Derrida, but they were certainly swept up by the currents of mainstream American politics and culture. Two historical events stand out as critical to our understanding of the attractions and Weberian charisma of trauma studies. One, the introduction of post-traumatic syndrome in the DSM and its expanding definition. It was very restricted to war trauma and sexual trauma, and then it just keeps going on. It's sort of, for a while it even encompassed multiple personality disorder, which is now called dissociative identity disorder. The entry in trauma just is very malleable. Every year it becomes bigger and bigger. And two, the other conditioning, historical condition that made trauma studies so attractive to academics was actually something they would be ashamed of acknowledging, which is the growing success and power of the Oprah Winfrey Show on daytime television. As left television critic Robert McChesney once wrote, "It's the media, stupid." Although literary theorists do not engage with television studies or broadcast media at all, we should emphasize in this historicization of trauma studies that Winfrey hosted the most popular talk show on television in the late 80s throughout the 90s, and the language that she used to talk about trauma in literature in the form of the Oprah Winfrey Book Club was in the background of the cultural and social landscape in which Carruth and Feldman were writing. Oprah Winfrey was authoring modes of communication based on marketing a contained and manageable form of trauma as storytelling that allowed broadcast audiences to witness and consume the most grisly stories of trauma. She was laying down the principles by which a certain kind of public articulation of private suffering on the part of celebrities would provide a new form of affective identification with the rich and famous. If Louis B. Mayer, like Hollywood mogul deluxe, because most of you were too young to remember this, if Louis B. Mayer, who was the mayor of MGM, in Hollywood's golden era, worked to control and polish the public images of his stars, like Rita Hayworth, who's actually Mexican-American and discovered in Tijuana. He didn't want any of his stars to appear in any way deviant from an American normal or glorious image of beauty, masculine and feminine. The stars today themselves are more than eager to introduce their private travails for public consumption. Oprah's own brand has known its ups and downs in the 1980s and 90s, reviled by conservatives like William Bennett and liberals like Ralph Nader for promoting cultural rot and trash TV. Winfrey actually pioneered the daytime talk show format, destroying Phil Donahue's audience share by featuring topics like gossips and their victims, 1986, to My Teenage Daughter is Driving Me Crazy, 1994. She burnished her reputation, however, as a national healer and taste leader by pivoting to literary matters when she started Oprah's book club in the mid-1990s, a savvy move that distinguished her from the Sally Jesse Raphaels, Jerry Springers, and Pontel Williams, who were her biggest competitors at the time. Her rebranding as a figure of enormous dignity and prestige was so successful that in 2001, she was invited by Rudy Giuliani to lead the Prayer for America at Yankee Stadium 12 days after the attack on the World Trade Center. Winfrey has been a master of televised intimacy. She understood the medium, her audience, and TV's role in defining a market by inserting itself in the fabric of a female-dominated domestic space and its consumption practices. In fact, in 1986, Winfrey electrified her audiences when she confessed to having been a victim of childhood sexual assault. I'm going to play it. Well, I'll tell you. She was, in this clip, articulate, poised, and already famous. Winfrey's justification for the public communication of her past experiences was focused on allowing others who are in the closet about childhood sexual abuse, both victims and perpetrators, to be able to walk through an open door.
Because I was raped by a relative. At the time, he was 19 years old. I hadn't seen or spoken to him since the day it happened, but I remember every single detail. You see, there really is no darker secret than sexual abuse. I'm telling you about myself so that maybe the closet where so many sexual abuse victims and their molesters hide might swing open just a crack today and let some light in.
Winfrey uses the image of being shut in a closet to describe the secret lives and shame of abuse and incest survivors. She uses the image of the closet without alluding directly to gay rights and even the AIDS epidemic. And she follows Ronald Reagan, who also never allowed himself to mention the AIDS health crisis or the gay men suffering from the pandemic throughout his presidency. Winfrey might have followed his lead, but she was savvy enough to use the terms of gay liberation without frightening her mostly suburban, white female audience by actually talking about gay people or gay sex. To open the closet door for survivors, Winfrey also featured Trudy Chase in 1993 on her show. Chase was one of the most notorious survivors of just horrific childhood sexual abuse, and she had allegedly 93 personalities that she developed as a way of dealing with her gruesome childhood experiences. That was 1993. Kathy Carruth's Unclaimed Experience, Drama, Narrative, and History was published in 1996, and that was the same year that Winfrey started her bestseller-making machine and prestige capitalizing operation, Oprah's Book Club, offering her version of a popular and public forum for discussing trauma and literature. More recently, in 2001, Oprah Winfrey launched a series on Apple TV called The Me You Can't See, featuring her own elaboration of her trauma as a child while offering media spaces for celebrities like Prince Harry and Lady Gaga to talk about their respective experiences of violence and trauma. According to the editors of the 2020 Routledge anthology, Smith and Maritoya, they argue that trauma is a critical concept for understanding literature and human experience in modernity. For trauma studies, however, there's one form of distress that does not occur in this book, and that's economic. A quick phrase search in the volume, luckily I have Adobe, so this is the amazing thing about electronic media. A quick phrase search in the volume reveals that economic crisis is not mentioned a single time, and that the chapter that is called Trauma Studies in the Digital Age by Hungarian scholar Anna Majid deals with social spaces of social media spaces of mourning and communication, especially as spaces of dealing with post-socialist trauma in Eastern Europe. These are all spaces of Facebook groups. The article does not address the evolution of social media itself or the company as agents of surveillance and advertising. This is 2020. I mean, there's been a lot of stuff done on Facebook's sort of infernal algorithm, but this article doesn't mention it. With little to no awareness of how trauma has been instrumentalized to create clickbait, build brands, and commodify mental health as a realm of experience that can be shared and processed collectively in online social media spaces, the very structures of publicity and publicness are taken for granted by Maynard, and Facebook is celebrated unquestioningly as providing a therapeutic community. This is a, Maynard creates this chart for understanding trauma studies. And I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, but I just wanted to give you an idea of how there is no mention of digital media companies in that digital media processing square. Shoshana Zuboff, business professor emerita from Harvard University, or Harvard Business School, wrote Surveillance Capitalism, a business history of how Google, Alphabet, and Facebook Meta, they're also trying to rebrand too, like Oprah, became the extraordinarily profitable corporations that they are today. And she focuses on the technological and business decisions made by Sergey Brin and Mark Zuckerberg in the early aughts to gather information about its users' behaviors online in order to sell that information to advertisers. Fred Turner's book, From Cyberculture to Counterculture, details the way in which Silicon Valley companies had their roots in the 1960s elite rejection of old left, old Marxist ideals in favor of the new left, or new communitarianism. From the Whole Earth catalog evolved the World Wide Web, a briefly utopic moment in the digital age that proposed the emancipation of information and knowledge from exclusionary institutions like universities, network television, and newspapers. The Whole Earth catalog, as most of you are too young to remember, was this thing that you could get in the mail that Stuart Brand drew up so that you could order things online to create your own commune, your own anarchic commune. So you could order things for your garden, drip irrigation systems, things for your RV, and Turner shows how Brand, who was at the core of developing World Wide Web, used the Whole Earth catalog as his model for how the World Wide Web was going to make information about our sort of autonomous communities available for everyone. I really recommend that book if you haven't read it. So the World Wide Web was a briefly utopic moment in the digital age that proposed the emancipation of information and knowledge. And universities, governments, network TV, newspapers were all bad. The internet was good. Google/Alphabet's motto, do no evil, evolved out of these early utopian dreams of connectedness that turned in the early 2000s, after the first dot-com crash, into a digital world of tracking, surveillance, and enforced sociability, which is the world we know today as social media, enabled by smartphones and other mobile devices to which we are addicted. To say public communication of trauma stories has become a way for celebrities and politicians to brand themselves is easy. To understand this form of ideologically framed social media trauma spaces, to understand this form of ideologically framed social media trauma is to understand how it creates pseudo-intimacy with celebrities in the name of a digitally mediated mental health discourse. And it is to put today's social media trauma stories in relationship to the transformation of the public sphere that has taken place in our post-industrial age. Liberal and progressive political actors, imbued with professional managerial class values, find ways of communicating with their social media followings by softening the boundaries between the personal and the political in order to persuade their viewers of their suffering and their authenticity. Witness the Instagram live feed that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did in the days following the January 6, 2021 occupation of the Capitol building.
That harrowing account we're getting from inside the siege on Capitol Hill from Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, speaking out on Instagram Live last night, detailing the traumatic experience. Our congressional correspondent Rachel Scott is in Washington for us with more. Rachel, good morning.
TJ, good morning. Up until now, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has not gone into full detail about what happened here on January 6th, but now she's opening up about the moments she feared for her life.
I mean, I thought I was going to die.
Overnight, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez detailing her terrifying experience during the Capitol insurrection for the first time, sharing the harrowing moments she thought might be her last.
And I'm fully expecting one of these insurrectionists to turn the corner with a gun.
In the Instagram live video that has now racked up over 1.5 million views, Ocasio-Cortez describes hearing a loud banging on her office door, taking cover in the bathroom.
I have never been quieter in my entire life. I felt that if this was the journey that my life was taking, that I felt that things were going to be okay. And that, you know, I had fulfilled my purpose.
The pounding at the door turned out to be a Capitol police officer, instructing her to flee. After running to another building, she found Congresswoman Katie Porter. The two barricaded themselves in her office along with members of their staff for hours.
And I didn't feel like I was okay or, you know, secure in any way at any point.
Ocasio-Cortez comparing that day to another past trauma, revealing she is also a survivor of sexual assault.
And I haven't told many people that in my life. But when we go through trauma, trauma compounds on each other.
And TJ, she says she is opening up now because she believes there needs to be accountability.
So there's a lot to talk about there, but let's go back to 1969, to coal country, far away from the California ideology and the halls of power in Washington, D.C. And let's consider the murder of Joseph Yablonski, a leader in the United Mine Workers Union, gunned down with his family, his wife and 25-year-old daughter on New Year's Eve in their home. Jefferson Cowie opens his book, Staying Alive, the 1970s and the Last Days of the American Working Class, with a description of Yablonski's brutal murder. Yablonski was a union reformer, willing to challenge the authoritarian leadership of Tony Boyle for leadership of the United Mine Workers Union. Yablonski was no outside insurrectionist. He was a union insider. He had started working in the mines at the age of 15 and was promoted in the union by its leaders. But he was committed to improving conditions for workers and making the union itself more democratic. He challenged Boyle's corrupt and thuggish leadership style and demanded greater transparency. Only in 1973 was Boyle convicted of ordering the murder of Jock Yablonski and his entire family. The labor movement in the United States has known more than its fair share of violence, with present-day philanthropic institutions named after the very men like Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick of the Frick Collection, who were more than willing to order the murder of striking workers when it suited their profit margins. So you're saying, okay, their bosses, the unions were so corrupt, Boyle ordered the murder of a fellow union leader. By the 1970s, UMWA, as well as some of the AFC-LO, they were run like mob organizations as well, and totally in cahoots with the bosses. The late 1960s and early 1970s were violent years in U.S. history, but trauma studies abstracts that worker unrest and the violence of wage labor by ignoring it, by talking about a kind of abstract suffering that can only be witnessed through this kind of elaborate theoretical apparatus. Trauma studies lends itself to a decontextualized, impoverished reading of historical struggles that occlude political contradictions, and for good reason. Trauma has become a professional managerial class way of dealing with historical violence, and its focus on faraway genocides that suit American foreign policy serve an ideological purpose. The domestic economic violence and war on the working classes waged by the technocrats with instruments like NAFTA and globalization-friendly policies to ship American jobs overseas was not a natural disaster. The damage wrought by these policies on the American working class are entirely man-made. I'll say man-made, not human-made. Sociologist Jennifer Silva's work in the town she names Cold Brook in western Pennsylvania, close to Yablonski's old home, is a careful documentation of how former miners and new African-American and Puerto Rican residents who have moved from Philadelphia to escape the violence of the city have experienced the class war waged against them by elites of both parties. Silva, in her first book, Coming Up Short, Working Class Adulthood in an Age of Uncertainty, explores the ways in which working class young people in coal country came of age at a time of deindustrialization and massive economic instability. In her second book, she returns to coal country to examine the ways in which southwestern rural Pennsylvanians give meaning to pain, both physical and psychological. You know, as an aside, she mentions the opioid addiction, but now we know, that there was a concerted attempt and successful attempt by Purdue Pharma to dump 300 million OxyContin pills in the state of West Virginia alone, in Appalachia, in the former mining areas. If the economic trauma of deindustrializing cities and towns are not worthy of mention in trauma studies, it is not simply a question of representational oversight in an academic discipline. In fact, the claim of the 2020 Routledge Companion is to be interdisciplinary. But a simple glance at economics, history, or left-wing sociology might have been a disciplinary tonic for trauma studies scholars. But the suffering of the working class is not the stuff of literary or theoretical investigation. Trauma studies wants to render the PMC both the privileged subjects of trauma with unique recourse to experts who explain the physiological and psychological consequences of trauma on the PMC-friendly body by rendering it a part of a literary and cultural text. I understand AOC's attempt to make visible the nature of the fear she experienced in her office on January 6, 2021. I do think trauma builds upon itself. Witnessing public figures, celebrities, and politicians like AOC talk about their trauma draws us more deeply into the culture of pseudotherapy, or what Jody Dean calls communicative capitalism. Celebrities and political figures are being invited to make public their most private experiences of suffering. From Lady Gaga to Roxane Gay to Charles Blow, famous people can enhance their fame by coming out of the closet with their past experiences to become not just famous people, but survivors. What does this mean for the consuming public, the average worker, the ordinary person who cannot make ends meet, whose life is always precariously balanced a paycheck or a credit card payment away from disaster? Our fractured public sphere is dominated today by the values of the American professional managerial class, which is deeply committed to monetization of private experiences. This class accepts the power of algorithmic surveillance, which is at its fingertips, and the humanistic aspect of this class simply ignores the infrastructure of social media. The PMC works tirelessly to legitimize its management of the economy, domination of workers, work processes, and the working class itself. In fact, the majority of Americans, in fact, the majority of people all over the world, of all races and sexes. The soft authoritarianism of the professional managerial class is built on its domination of the culture industry, which controls content production on social media and network television and cable television too. On corporate platforms, the PMC content production has cemented its hold on an impoverished, instrumentalized, and depoliticized concept of healing and trauma and suffering and violence. It has consolidated its victory over classical liberalism, and it has institutionalized its embrace of anti-democratic politics. Trauma and the packaging of traumatic experience into publicly consumable individual stories of catastrophic injury have become a cultural and political calling card for a new generation of liberal elites, some of whom are young enough to have been weaned on Tumblr and its proliferating communities of difference. The packaging of trauma narratives and its concomitant erasure of history and class struggle set the scene in self-help and academic discourse to destroy our ability to imagine collective suffering that could lead to, in turn, collective action. In the 1990s, the PMC was filled with energy and optimism. The credentialed elites were quickly becoming a financial elite, and those who were left behind could be consigned in the shadow of a failed system, socialism, whose ideologies, institutions, and leaders were crumbling away. As the economic cohort of the successful PMC reached self-awareness, they became more and more confident in their power to supplant traditional liberalism in public discourse and politics. So what I mean by traditional liberalism here is the liberalism of the coffee house, where you have to argue for your position and exercise reason and make rigorous arguments, scientific or philosophical, to support yourself. With this new, I would say, soft authoritarian public sphere, all you have to do is say you're a survivor, and no one can question what you're saying anymore. After the fall of the Soviet bloc and the rise of Bill Clinton, the American PMC gained the confidence that allowed them to declare the definitive victory of capitalism over all of their forms of economic organization in the name of freedom, and two, to articulate a theory of trauma and politics that professionalized and specialized processes of healing and listening that aimed at nothing less than the complete reimagination of violence outside of economic exploitation. What is trauma in the digital age, then? One answer might be PMC managed clickbait, or social media and academic content for anti-social ends. If psychoanalysis suggested that we actually are all survivors of trauma, the trauma of separation from our original caregivers, usually mothers, individual understandings of the unconscious meaning of that trauma is infinitely varied and deeply disturbing. For trauma studies and trauma as digital content, the stories of suffering and their meanings are remarkably similar, unsatisfying, superficial, and easy to consume. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand, get a microphone, and then ask your question.
And if I'm typing, I'm just taking
And don't be shy. Just go ahead, ask any question you want. I mean,
Looks like we have
if you don't, I'm going to have to give the microphone to James.
I think we have one.
Okay.
Good.
I hate to preempt the president, but we do have a student eager to ask a question. Here you go, Jeff.
Thank you. Sorry, I just dropped my computer, so I have to re-find where my question was. My question is to what degree do you see yourself as a member of the professional managerial class, and would there be other ways that you would want to share your ideas in order to promote your cause and that don't rely on modes that are heavily coded in capitalism? If your message is what you would consider radical, what radical means might be more effective in conveying it?
Okay, number one, I'm not a radical. I want to normalize socialism and the critique of capitalism. I think radicality is like a very 60s thing, like, I'm radical, you should all follow me. No, I'm not radical. Number two, I will not give up on the critique of capitalism, sorry. And number three, I am a member of the professional managerial class. I like to think of myself as a class traitor. I'm a first generation PMC person. Even though my father went to college, he's deeply imbued with, his own class identity, which was peasant. He comes from thousands of years of peasantry. And in many ways, the trajectory of my life is very much like an American meritocratic success story, right? You know, he comes with $20 in his pocket, and he works his way up, gets a job at the UN, sends his children to college. And I really believed in liberalism, and I believed in the American way. I still think it's really important to have rule of law and to have habeas corpus and things like that. But everywhere I see this country's democratic values in shambles. And I do believe that there are certain things that should not be monetized. One of them, private experience, the other one, higher education. And I teach in a university that asks for, tuition. So there are all these different ways in which I'm not pure, but I don't believe in purity in that way or radicalism. I believe in fighting for a sense of equality and justice. And I think that the capitalism has rendered us a world where people like me really have good lives, and the majority of people have really shitty lives, and we're also destroying the planet. And my life is good because I played by certain rules of professionalism, but those very rules of professionalism now are being flouted and betrayed by universities in the name of fundraising, in the name of adhering to certain kinds of ideological rules that come out of like the liberal side of things, actually. So those are my answers. I would like to see an overturning of this class and an honoring of working class experiences in life worlds. Okay. I don't know if that's a good answer, but yeah, really rich people now are like, I'm a radical, I'm an activist. Like everyone's like, I'm a model and an activist. What does that mean? You're not all right, then I'm not an activist, I'm not, if you can have that space, I'm not taking it.
Yep, right here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Liu, for your comments. My name is Belle, and I'm a social work student here at University of New England. And a little bit of an aside from your presentation, but I'm fascinated about your comments about Oprah and her rebrand, specifically around her book club. And I know another media, conglomerate to the tune of capitalism, Reese Witherspoon, has also made an interesting parlay from, Cruel Intentions and the idea of Legally Blonde, and made quite a niche for herself in projecting a lot of her own books of choice. And she has quite a following on social media of what you should read, and kind of this idea of white courageous women. And she's really made a niche for like the Brene Browns and the Glennon Doyles to be really successful in their own right. There's like this term, I think, in social work called trauma porn, and it's meant to be provocative, and it's meant to be really evocative of being unable to look away from that train wreck. And you allude to it, and I really noticed that in your presentation, from the court to the coffee house. And I was just wondering, from your experience, especially in the classroom, how you would counsel or how you would speak to students about what that looks like, from understanding trauma and educating around it to then being, I hesitate to use the word, addicted to trauma.
Oof. Well, thank you. I'm not in that field, but I mean, that's something that you guys would be dealing with much more than I would, because I'm in film and media studies, and I can take a more, I can say it's part of the horror genre, right? It's fictional. A lot of the stuff that I talk about is fiction, social fictions. But what you're talking about is the spectacularization of suffering and having this voyeuristic idea of sort of taking some kind of perverse enjoyment from watching other people suffer. And that's actually a lot of what happened with the George Floyd video. I thought it was just obscene that it was being played all the time. And it has to do with the 24-hour news cycle and everything. And I think that I'm not sure pedagogically what I would do with this, because I just try to frame things for my students as part of spectacle and say, it's not an authentic experience. And so a critique of voyeurism is definitely part of film and media studies. Like, you feel safe. You're watching something you think is reality, but it's based on your voyeurism, your feeling of safety, and you're watching someone else's suffering. That creates this kind of visual pleasure. And what I didn't mention in the paper, Reese Witherspoon is a really good example of this monetization of these tales of suffering, was that Oprah's book club was so successful that when you went on there, your book could have been selling 10,000 copies, then you're selling 1 million copies. If you're selling 1 million copies, you can imagine what your next advance will be, what your royalties are. So there was... James Frey wrote 1 Million Little Pieces, and then and it was a great memoir. It was on Oprah. He was featured on Oprah. It was about his addiction to alcohol. And it turns out he made up the whole story, right? So they had to pulp his book and everything. And that is another kind of trauma porn, where you make up things to get on Oprah's book club. There was another story of a child Holocaust survivor, which I don't think ever would have existed without this whole industry. It was by Benjamin Mirsky. He was a Swiss Jewish boy who had been adopted by a Swiss family during the Holocaust, but he then writes a pseudo-memoir about his having been in the camps in Auschwitz, and it is also a huge bestseller. And then it turns out like he spent the war, well and warm in a small village in Switzerland. So there was this pressure to produce a certain kind of book that would attract Oprah's attention. I mean, one of the most scandalous ones was Catherine Harrison's The Kiss, which was a memoir about her 4-year affair with her father. So even though she's trying to rebrand at the time, Oprah understands like how things will attract people's attention. And Witherspoon is taking that initiative and sort of imitating what Oprah did by being a feminist and by openly publicizing this. And I think it's a real problem for therapists and social workers, because there's such a mass-mediated way of having relationship to the suffering of others that distorts our own relationship of suffering to ourselves, and it's terrible. Once again, I think the political economy of this industry is the only way to confront it, and to explain to your clients or explain to your students, like, there's a history of how this happens. It's just, Reese Witherspoon didn't come around going, oh my God, people are suffering, and I'm gonna, start a book club about it. It was not spontaneous. It was a really logical, market-driven rebrand that she did.
Yeah, he's got you right there.
Right over here, Professor Liu.
Hi there. I just wanted to also comment on the Oprah story. So basically what you're saying is that as much as Oprah had her heartache with being sexually abused, she used that trauma to create herself being famous.
She used the public communication of that trauma to enhance her fame. And it was very courageous, because if you think about 1972, what happened to Eagleton and his suffering and mental illness, and then in 1986 she comes out and says this on TV. It is courageous. I'm not taking that away from her, but it was a very strategic moment of courage.
So I guess like every single person, my question is that we all have, like we spoke about when I met you in the introductory over there, that everybody has their own trauma, and I guess whoever gets in the limelight to talk about their trauma and somebody hears it in a bigger way, or the right people are listening to you at the right time, you're gonna make money, and you're gonna get into the digital world and spread it to everybody.
So what I'm saying is actually that yes, we're all traumatized, but only the famous people get to monetize their trauma. So not all trauma stories are created equally. And what makes me sad about this industry is that the legitimate avenues of healing might be avoided by people who don't want to confront themselves in a real psychotherapy and instead opt for this pseudo-therapy that is social media that can be so superficially satisfying. Like in the Facebook groups, like of surviving totalitarianism. Just that was like hilarious Facebook group.
Is there a way of challenging what you are suggesting exists today?
What do you mean by challenging?
I mean, obviously, it is detrimental to our society if we continue along that road, yes?
Yeah.
How would you suggest looking at that would be beneficial to the culture?
Well, one thing is, you know, I'm a professor, I'm a researcher, doing this research and making it public, and being invited by Anouar to make, to present this paper. Now, this industry has a reach of hundreds of millions of people. I'm sort of just speaking to, even 100 or 1,000 people is very good for me. But, you know, I think that people within the healing industries, within my industry, we can be more critical of what's come up in the world. And we should be challenging them. We should not be, you know, sitting there twiddling our thumbs, looking at our navels and trying to look smart. So I would like to see academics take this on in a more vigorous way, and start from there. So I have to start from there. I have to start from, I'm not going to go on Oprah because she's not going to have me, but I'd be like, oh yeah, this is BS, people. That would just be building my brand. Like, Oprah, honey, I don't want to hear from you. You're worth $500 gazillion. What about the stuff? That would just stage another spectacle. I'm trying to model a kind of rational research, psychologically rigorous approach to things so that we can, in academia, take some kind of resistance to this, you know, reified survivor culture that we live in. That's all I can do for me, for within my abilities. But you know what? There should be a lot more people saying what I'm saying.
Catherine, what I find amazing about your thesis and your perspective is you're coming at this subject not from the right. And could you say something more about this? Because very often people associate this kind of criticism with conservatives and so on, but you seem to be in a kind of agreement with some of those perspectives, but you're coming at it from a different angle.
So I'm a socialist who really believes in democracy, a Christopher Lashian socialist, and I feel like to live in a democracy means we have to have civic virtues, not PMC virtues, but civic virtues, which means that when we participate in public discussion, we use our reason, not our identity, to argue with other people. And I often think that if we did that, then we would realize like socialism was the most rational organization of our resources and the most rational organization of pleasure and leisure and work at the same time. But I've been thinking about this a lot lately, like what are the qualities that are rewarded by this culture of survivorship and pseudotherapy? Their willingness to make these kinds of superficial, what I would call superficial confessions, and I think that as someone who went through, you know, not extraordinary, but ordinary, intense difficulties as a child that had to do with immigration and class structure and all this other stuff, my great relief was in being able to participate in reasoned and rational discussion in a classroom. I don't want to talk about me. I don't want to talk about trauma. I want to have robust, lively discussions. And if that is, right now we're not having them, and we're not having them between conservatives and liberals, but sometimes I stage them in my mind. Like, what is the ideal liberal affective type political subject now? What is the ideal leftist political subject? What is the conservative subject? The conservative subject right now doesn't seem to be someone who really respects literature or the traditions anymore. It seems to be a more transgressive subject, like, because of Trump, really. But the liberal ideal political subject is one that is a survivor, respecting, tolerating difference, and imbued in grievance culture, and everyone has to be included and grieved. And then if you show any bias to me, I accuse you of being a racist, and that's the way liberals have discussion, and Trump is like this transgressive thing. And so I was thinking, like, what is the left opposition to this? And I want to see a socialist civic virtue person, like someone who thinks about heroism and sacrifice in a left way. And we've left all of those values for the conservatives, like heroism. To say heroism and sacrifice makes me sound like Jordan Peterson or something. But what I really believe in is that we need to have enough social care and stability to be able to exercise our reason together so that we don't bring our baggage in. I don't want you to bring your baggage into this discussion now. I don't want to drag my baggage into this discussion. I don't want to terrorize you with the fear of giving me offense. And I don't want, Trump just saying whatever he wants and being like a racist and a misogynist either. So how can we talk about, the class struggle in a rational way? And what is a struggle to which we would sacrifice our self-interest or our comforts at this point? These are not fashionable topics on the left, because we think of those, or on the liberal side, because we think of those values as like part of toxic masculinity. But I think that it's really important for all of us, and it was really important for me as a kid reading literature to think about, like, what is honor and what is virtue outside of a religious setting. So what is political civic virtue? It's not based on, covering my ass and being like, oh yeah, well, I'm fine. No one's happy actually living that way. But the PMC is so antisocial and is based upon these, its operations right now are based all on these ideas of self-interest. And conservatives say, like, you guys don't believe in free debate. Well, they're actually a little bit right there, because the liberals just want to call names. So I want to take a third position, which is the left position that I've described. Anyway.
One more thing. One of the striking things, as you're speaking, and I wish James would have said something because he's a psychologist and he knows a lot about this.
Let him say that.
But what I'm saying is, by focusing on interior experiences, by bringing, what's happening is there's an impoverishment of other kinds of, the culture of the Enlightenment, the pursuit of knowledge and history for its own sake. So what happens is knowledge has become gradually concentrated into, has become a series of confessions, and that are, like you say, being monetized. And by doing so, by privileging this kind of interior experiences as the ultimate form of discourse in our culture, we are impoverishing the culture at large. Would you?
Yeah, I mean, another thing that you could say is that it's so deeply anti-intellectual and anti-historical. A lot of my profession right now in the humanities is like having a gotcha attitude, or it says you're like, gotcha, Freud is a sexist, Freud is, Marx is a dead white man. That gotcha attitude, that's so disrespectful of the traditions that we've inherited and that make up any sense of justice, that should inform what we think of as justice. And all of these things are open to debate, but so few debates are being had right now.
Okay. I teach a course at UNE called Trauma Responsive Education, and one of the units we cover is about adverse experiences and about the trauma in the body. But then more than 3/4 of the class is about resilience and strategies to use in the classroom to support the students moving forward. So back to Oprah, because I do love her. She just wrote a book with Dr. Bruce Perry called What Happened to You. I wonder if in your research you found celebrities using their voice to promote resilience or in a positive way.
I don't say Oprah is completely negative. I think her opening up about her own experience, like, broke through something. Like the the Thomas Eagleton McGovern thing would not happen today, partially because Oprah made that intervention. Like, Eagleton would have less shame about his having had shock therapy for depression. You know, so destigmatizing mental illness is an important thing. But I find it all very formulaic, what she writes about trauma, and she's this composed, successful person. Of course she's resilient. I'd be resilient, I'm resilient, but I'd be even more resilient if I had her bank account. I think that one of the things that, I think it's important to promote resilience, but I don't know if consuming media is really a way of doing it. So it becomes too entertaining in a way. And what we need to do when we get to healing is actually confront some really dark truths about ourselves that is not entertaining, that we wouldn't want to share with everyone. Oprah has many secrets she's not sharing with us. Do not believe that she is, completely an open book. And so I think to consume her skeptically might be a way. I know a lot of people love her, and she's been very important to many people. I want to respect that, but I also want to criticize her at the same time.
So I took the bait. Anouar forced me. So it was fascinating talk. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. You wove together a number of different themes, right? So you have a critique of trauma, you have the role of the media and the evolution of the media to now social media and the role that that's played. The arguments about grand economic systems, the critique of power structures. I mean, there's just so much there. And you link them all together really nicely. I guess 2 comments or questions. One is, I'm not convinced that they're all necessarily linked. I think you can link them in the way that you did, but one could give a critique of trauma, for example, without embracing socialism, as you define it. One could likewise talk about, the same thing, a critique of the media and the role that that's played. The one thing, though, that I do think is more fundamental that kind of across is that what's happening now in so many grievance studies is that we are, it's created, whether intentionally or not, by various power structures, created a smokescreen to distract from real progress. So, for example, we know there's about 3, 4, 5 things we could do that would within a decade or 2, would greatly improve equality, racial equality in this country, right? We know very concrete things. They're not terribly sexy, but they're very concrete things. But instead, we spend our time arguing about, the microaggressions and trying to root out these sort of hidden forms of racism that may or may not be there, when in fact there are problems, the solutions are staring us in the face. Mm-hmm. So you seem to be arguing that that's all very intentional, that you have an elite power structure that is intentionally trying to distract everyone with these sorts of things.
I'm not quite QAnon, but yeah, that sounds like it.
And I guess and that may be the case, but so yeah, I guess I would wonder what you would think about that argument, that this goes beyond trauma to grievance narratives more broadly, and how they distract us from the things that really would move the needle on the things we...
I totally agree. I totally agree with that assessment. And I do believe that, there are tiny steps to demonetization of certain parts of our lives that would immediately relieve a lot of the economic, social, and racial inequality that we have today. And this is a real distraction. But you're questioning whether or not this sort of, bread and circuses is an intentional, coordinated part of the media landscape that allows, corporate malfeasance to go on, or the financialization of education or retirement and healthcare to go on. It may not be coordinated, but it seems like too much of a coincidence that we become so distracted by this, and that this has happened, this kind of spectacles has happened in an age of deregulating network TV, the destruction of print journalism and long-form journalism, the fragmentation of any kind of news sources, the deauthorization of the news. And, there is a way of remedying that too, which is to make all journalistic venues nonprofit, to not burden our journalists with massive amounts of student loan debt, to have publicly financed local news coverage again, because we don't have any of that now. I mean, I'm staying at this beautiful hotel in Portland that you put me up in, thank you. It used to be the Gannett headquarters. It used to be a thriving publishing house. Now it's a boutique hotel with like decorative print on the wall. And all of those, I'm a socialist, but I'm also like nostalgic for the institutions of high liberalism, where like investigative journalism actually mattered and people read the same things and could debate the same things. I think we've gone way too far in deregulating the media and in allowing it to be this for-profit, Wild West enterprise.
Well, thank you so much. I was hoping to hear because I have eminent psychologists in the room, does coming out on TV as a survivor, does it actually heal people, or does it keep them in the same?
I was a fan of AOC's. I am a fan of AOC. And watching her do that, I kept saying, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. I watched it live. And I don't know if this really personally helps her. I know that it confused and muddied the waters of political debate about the meaning of January 6th. But she goes, I haven't told many people this. And I was like, okay, so don't tell 300,000 random strangers on Instagram Live. Do not go there. Just don't do it. It trivialized her, but it also made her vulnerable to the mockery of people who hated her. And I don't think that, as someone who suffered from traumas, that this is what you want to do either. So like, the events were frightening enough in and of themselves. Like, focus on that.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. What a great event. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.